And a lot has been said about the Government of National Unity and how it's going to function. President Ramaphosa's opening of Parliament address gave an overview of what the 7th administration plans to focus on. Now, while some experts are concerned by parliamentary oversight and what it will entail under a GNU, others are concerned by policies and what the GNU will prioritise. But let's get some insights on this. And for that, we're joined by Emeritus Professor of Public Law at UCT, Professor Hugh, and public policy expert at the Wits School of Governance, Dr. TK Pooe. Gentlemen, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. You both have written very interesting pieces really on accountability and the way forward for the Government of National Unity. Prof. Coote, I think I want to start a little bit with you, right? I think one of the things that we saw coming out of the opening of Parliament addresses, I mean, if you look at some of the reactions that you got from parties like the IFP and the DA to the President's address, a very different tone to what you would have heard their responses to be in previous State of the Nation addresses, right, from the President. And one wonders if that change of tone in any way brings about any concern around what accountability will look like in this Government of National Unity. You've looked at that and said, well, in this GNU, who holds the executive accountable? Explain that concern for us, Prof.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. My concern arises from our last 30 years. Under our government since 1994, and I'm not even obviously going to go back into the apartheid days when it was 100 times worse. But because of the dominance of one party in government, the ANC, and because of the strength of the party whip, as it is called, that you discuss things behind closed doors in the party caucus, and once you agree on a line, everybody's got to stick to that line. That was taken to the extreme, so much so that the duty on Parliament, which is in the Constitution and spelled out in terms in Section 55(2). The duty on Parliament to hold the executive, the cabinet, to account, to monitor it and hold it to account, was eroded by the party whip through the portfolio committee system. And so the opposition parties had to try to play a role, and often they were frustrated because the chairs of all the portfolio committees, 29 out of the 30, were ANC members who just protected the executive. Now, we have a different situation because we have a multi-party executive. We also have 8 portfolio committee chairs who are drawn from the other partners in the Government of National Unity, not the ANC. And the question is, will the party whips be so strong as to corral the MPs not to ask difficult questions, particularly of the ministers who are drawn from their own political parties? That's the concern.
Yeah, Dr. Pooe, you wrote a piece as well. It's titled, "The Magic Word for Government Isn't More Policy, but Incrementalism." And I found this particular part of it really interesting, where you say, and again, if we focus on accountability, you say it's pertinent that citizens, especially those able to hold frank talks with them, the cabinet, of course, like business and local communities, do not fall prey to the illusions of Tuma binarism, new dawn issues 2.0, like in 2019. Unpack that for us, if you will.
No, thanks for having me. And I think it's a similar vein as Professor Coote, namely the fact that, look, when President Ramaphosa came in 2019, it almost as though people's ability to critique government and critique what government was supposed to do also took a back seat. Some people might argue that they said, listen, we've been under the former regime, which was President Jacob Zuma, that people like, you know what, this guy is not going to be like him. They gave him, I think I can equivocate it to when President Obama was given the Nobel Prize before actually stopping any war. So that's what I was talking about, that look, to be critical doesn't mean that you simply say everything government does is wrong, but you do kind of say, listen, as a citizenry, we've got an expectation and we all know what our problems are. It cannot be that somebody who's a president or who's a minister just comes up to a podium and says, we're working on it, just give us time. And I think that's what tended to happen in 2019. That's why I'm saying we need to be vigilant and actually ask key questions to say, listen, what are your timelines? When you speak about wanting to make South Africa a construction site, when you speak about wanting to improve the economy, when you speak about wanting to improve local government, what are your timelines? What are you actually aiming to do? Because it took about South Africans 3 or 4 years to finally figure out that, wait, the president, much like his cabinet at the time, wasn't sure what to do. And he almost got a free pass. So that's what I'm speaking about, that we shouldn't get into Tumamina Part 2, 2.0, where we just simply sit back, relax, and say, no, these guys have got it covered because they're not like the previous people. The one thing the world over, which we have to understand, is politicians are politicians. They look after themselves, number one. And if you don't put a stick to them very early on, they'll put a stick to you.
You know, we can certainly talk about, timelines and how, for instance, cabinet and even the president delivers on some of the promises and visions that are shared with us during an opening of Parliament address, for instance, and even budget votes, right, with the various ministries. But there's also the issue of accountability where corruption may be concerned. And I'm wondering, Prof, if in your view, there are issues that stick out at the moment that you feel, well, that is not being given the attention that it requires, perhaps because of this GNU, Prof?
Well, it's very early days, and I think we've got to, I hear entirely what Dr. TK is saying, and I'm with him 100% there. We've waited too long. I do think we've got to give the GNU a little bit of time to establish itself. The thing that worried me initially was the nomination of Dr. Klope to the JSC, where most of the partners in the GNU didn't object to that, despite all of the very good reasons given by civil society as to why, frankly, he shouldn't be in Parliament, and secondly, he shouldn't have gone to the JSC. Nevertheless, I've seen a couple of clips from the speeches which followed the opening of Parliament on Thursday, and there's been some encouraging, frank talk, if I can call it that way, to borrow from Steve Biko. There's been some encouraging frankness of expression by partners in the GNU, and my hope is that within the constraints and the necessary constraints of a bunch of parties ideologically quite different from each other, trying to work together, and I'm 100% behind that. Nevertheless, the critical faculty should be present. And let me just make one point. I said we'd had a dismal last 30 years. There were two periods of exception. One was under the Mandela regime, where everything was new and everything was up for grabs. There happened to be a government of national unity at that point, but that was less relevant. But there was a freshness and an enthusiasm which was captured by Freni Ginwala, the Speaker, in initiating new processes in Parliament. That dampened down under President Mbeki. It flowered again under President Kgalema Motlanthe, but for 9 months. And then all the lids got put back on multiple times under the Zuma regime. And we had the party lying to Parliament about the fire pool being a swimming, the swimming pool being a fire pool, the wrong way around, etc.
Yeah. There's so much talk right now about policy direction of the country under this GNU, and it's interesting because, TK, you say this is a grand coalition. You agree that it's not a GNU, but that's not the discussion we're going to have. But there's so much debate around what the GNU does from a policy point of view. I think about the position, for instance, that Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi might find himself in where NHI is concerned, right? Is it forward, is it back? And what are the modalities that need to be looked at? And of course, at 10 o'clock, the SG of the party is set to hold a briefing and perhaps give us their input on what the ANC would like to see done from a policy point of view. But in your piece, Dr. Pooe, you've written about how we are as a country known for mass production of policies and reports. So one wonders then if it even matters, if we sit and discuss the policy direction that we're moving in.
No, thanks for that. I think it's a point which sometimes gets missed. I probably should have also put in that we're also known for having this statement, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot, Naledi. South Africa has the best policies in the world. The only problem is implementation. Well, from a perspective of someone who studies public policy and his practices, that there's no such thing. Implementation is part of policy. If you don't have implementation, therefore your policy was not good. And I think that is the key problem in South Africa, that the government has rarely ever taken a step back to say, listen, what about this policy really does not work? What they tend to do is you go from, and I'm going to jump quickly, you start with an RDP, GEA, ASGISA, and then you had the new growth path, and then now you have something called the NDP, which I say is not really a policy, because when I used to work in local government, we used to call it the doorstopper because it's 400 pages of, it's telling you a story. It's not giving you where the country should be going. And I think that is the key problem. We don't lack for policy. What we lack for is actual, impactful policy. And when you ask the question about the NHI, look, NHI is a philosophical thing, right? You can either tend to take that direction, but the first step you need to start with is what is your current state of your public healthcare system? And I think that's been the big problem, is that government doesn't want to account for the failures of the public healthcare system, which they played a part in. So, because no one really has a problem saying, listen, people should have universal access to healthcare. But the question should be, is the public sector working? So again, that's a policy issue of saying, you're not fixing what the immediate policy problem is. You're simply putting a rubber stamp. You're simply creating a new fictitious vehicle called an NHI to say, listen, this is going to fix it. But the same problems are going to occur. You're just simply shifting the blame. You're shifting the pole to say, listen, now we're just bringing in the private sector. We don't know where and how, but we think there's going to be a solution there. And this really also applies to economic policy in South Africa. We go from saying we want to industrialize, but we don't actually fix the core issues of the day, which is our energy supply, transport, and infrastructure. That's why I was saying, in matters of expectation, this grand coalition, because that's what the real term we should be using is, the grand coalition should be saying less policy, but how do you make in the next 3 or 4 years those 3 key things? Let's just make these things work. And then we can get sexier policies going forward.
Yeah, I'm laughing at the sexier policies, right? The popular policies, if you will. Prof, one of the things that you, and I need to, of course, mention your piece as well. You wrote a piece titled, South Africa's new parliament needs to do a better job of holding cabinet to account. You, of course, are the legal scholar who weighs the chances. And, as part of that piece, you talk about how we need, I'm trying to find the wording that you've used, but you essentially have said that what needs to happen is, I suppose, a lot of discussion and collaboration and really talking about what the way forward is going to be. I wonder, though, if we're doing a lot of talking, right? And if it's sufficient, is it too much? I mean, you've got a cabinet lekgotla that now takes center stage in July, and then there's even talks about a national dialogue, for instance, that we heard yesterday, the EFF saying they're not going to be a part of that national dialogue. What is quality discussion? What is not?
Well, let me immediately say that I'm also more comfortable with Grand Coalition. I use GNU because you did, so I'm with Dr. TK there. I'm also with him on the failure to implement policies. And for me, the biggest policy that hasn't been properly implemented is the Constitution. And because the Constitution demands accountability on the part of Parliament, holding the executive to account. And without blowing my own trumpet, I wrote a report for Dr. Ginwala in Parliament in 1999, which expanded on the role of Parliament holding the executive accountable. It's called the Corder Report. The Zondo Commission got onto it and lamented the fact that Parliament has done almost nothing to implement the findings of that report. And so in that respect, we need I won't say we need no more talking because that would be arrogant, but we need to begin on implementation of measures within Parliament, but in a spirit of robust and respectful cooperation by the members of the Grand Coalition. That is what I mean. I don't want to spend the rest of Parliament spends the rest of its life in a talk shop.
Yeah, you show us that little book there, the Constitution, and one of the things that we heard this week, Dr. Pooe, is that, well, okay, officially now, opposition in the National Assembly is the MK party, for instance. This is the very same party that in its manifesto talked about constitutional reform. So is that a concern then for accountability of this grand coalition government of national unity, where the official opposition that you expect and hope will be holding leaders that are in government to account, perhaps has had a flawed relationship with the Constitution, Doctor?
Well, this is where probably I'll take a different tack to Prof. Corder, where I say I'm not a constitutionalist. I believe South Africa's constitution from the beginning was only supposed to be an interim document until society came to a point where we can then have a constructive conversation. And much like Prof. Corder, I don't think maybe the national dialogue is a constructive place. right? So I'm not so much, how do I put it? I'm not married to the South African Constitution. If anything, I'd rather maybe look at it this way. What about the MK? What don't they like about the Constitution? Because I think we should be able to be, not so much free, but I think we should be able to be brave enough to say, what is it about this Constitution that riles certain citizens up? And I think, look, if you come maybe from a more conservative perspective, there's something about the South African Constitution that doesn't sit quite well with you. And rather than us, closing this discussion, I think we should be opening it up to say, listen, the onus is on you then to take this conversation forward. So, like I said, I'm not really moved by the MK's objections to the Constitution. I'm more intrigued to say, what do you find about it? For instance, the work that I do, one of the things I do write about it's a field called law and development. We actually try to say, take the law as it is, and then try to ask the question, does it move South Africa forward economic development-wise? And this is why I think our Constitution has many mistakes within it. Key among them is I don't see why we need to have provincial structures. I don't see, like I said in my article, why we need over 257 municipalities. Because you see, we're taking it from a perspective of politics, and those negotiations that happened in 1994 are dictating. But we know well enough now in South Africa that, listen, in truth, what we really do need for a thriving society is we need a local government which is working and which is economically viable, so that people can actually say, listen, I prefer to stay where I come from at home. It's in Naval, in Everton. I prefer to stay there. I'm not going to be forced to have to go live and work in Joburg. I can actually just live where I am because it's economically viable. I'm not forced to go to the three centers, which is Cape Town, Durban. And when we say Joburg, I think we should probably just put in Ekurhuleni and Tshwane, because it's actually one thing at the end of the day, which is 60% of the economy of South Africa, which basically means we're basically ignoring other provinces like the Eastern Cape, like Limpopo, like in Mpumalanga. So for me, I'm not married to the Constitution, I'm married to economic development. And if it means that we need to change it, so be it.
That's a big project, TK. I mean, that's the reality of it, right? If you're talking about an overhaul and relooking at parts of the Constitution, that's a really big initiative that you're talking about, and one wonders if there's the time, the resources for that conversation to take place. And Prof. Kod, I think I'm going to bring that same question to you that I asked to Dr. Pooe about, all right, so you've got this relationship with the Constitution, the role that it plays in us and how we're all able to hold leaders account, and then officially in the opposition, you've got a party like the MK and even the EFF, for instance, that has always said, there's something about this Constitution that just doesn't sit well, and that there must be a constitutional overhaul. What does that mean for how they hold our leaders to account when that's the central document of our nation?
Well, my argument would be that they're bound by the Constitution for as long as it's in its present form. And I'm not against a review of the Constitution. Indeed, there's a standing committee in Parliament which has the title, the Constitutional Review Committee. What I understand, and I would distinguish from what I understand to be the policy of the EFF on the one hand and the MK on the other. The EFF says there's aspects of the Constitution that need to be reviewed. The MK says, throw the whole thing out, we want to go back to parliamentary sovereignty. I think, for example, Dr. TK's point about the provincial structures and local government, that's a topic which may be ripe for discussion. I remember the room at Kempton Park in 1993 where there was a big map of South Africa and people were drawing lines of where the provinces should be. There was a degree of arbitrariness about that in reality. So I believe, I am a constitutionalist, and I believe pretty passionately in the Constitution and its virtues. And I think, for me, the problem is not so much the language of the Constitution, or indeed the structures, but I'm prepared to chat about that. Yeah. But the failure of proper implementation.
I think we could talk for hours, but I'm going to have to wrap it up there, gentlemen. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Of course, our guests there, Professor Hugh, Professor Emeritus of Public Law at UCT in Cape Town, of course. And then, of course, Dr. TK Pooe, Public Policy Specialist at the Wits School of Governance here in Johannesburg, sharing their views on how we hold Cabinet to account in this government of national unity, or as they have called it, a grand coalition.